The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very honoured to rise in this House, as always, to speak on behalf of the people of Timmins, James Bay. I'm not pleased that Parliament is looking at this report as it stands now, because I believe that this report has made a mockery of the work of Parliament and the parliamentary committees, and has undermined, I think, in a very egregious manner, the objective of the Conflict of Interest Act and the promise that was made in 2006, certainly when the present Prime Minister came into town promising accountability. When we go back to 2006, after the endemic corruption that had beset Ottawa under years and years and years of the Liberal government, there were numerous problems identified with the corruption. It was the revolving door around the Prime Minister's office, the easy access of the lobbyists to keep people in position, the lack of accountability mechanisms for the people who, in the civil service in the very high levels, who were making the procurement decisions, the inability to divide clear walls between the political operatives of the government and the senior civil service to ensure accountability to the Canadian people. In 2006, the New Democratic Party worked in good faith with the incoming Conservative government because we believe in the issue of transparency and accountability, regardless of what party is in power, that the Canadian people expect this. Now, at the time, there were some obvious major failings in the efforts of the Accountability Act, and one of those failings was that we had pushed to have the Senate under the same code as the House of Commons, so that Canadians could trust that the fact that the House is elected and the Senate is not elected. I'm not going to get into that issue tonight, but there was a standard for ethical behaviour, and I think the Canadian public will certainly agree if the Senate had agreed to come under the Conflict of Interest Act, to have an empowered ethics commissioner and lobbying commissioner, that they might not be facing fraud, a number of their members, that they might not be under investigation the way they are tonight. But that doesn't mean that the Act itself, the way it was administered in Parliament, didn't have problems. And this was the reason for the 5-year statutory review. The reason for the 5-year statutory review is, well, we need to see what works and what doesn't. And certainly over the period of 5 years, a number of problems came forward in the Act that the original enshriners of the Act, the Conservative government at the time, and certainly working with the New Democrat opposition, may not have envisioned. One of the problems was the interpretation of the Conflict of Interest Act. We have President Commissioner Mary Dawson is very literal, so there's no deviation on the issue of apparent conflict of interest. And yet you will know, Mr. Speaker, that if you're dealing with lobbying, if you're dealing with people looking to get access, the issue of apparent conflicts of interest are as crucial as conflicts of interest, because it's very difficult to prove an exact conflict of interest, and of course, unless you have the actual body lying on the ground, the gun in the hand, and the ethics commissioner jumping in the door as it's all happening. So the issue of apparent conflict of interest would have been a reasonable amendment to clarify the roles of the ethics commissioner. We would need to clarify the roles of the lobbying commissioner and the ethics commissioner, because we've had the bizarre situation where the lobbying commissioner has found that lobbyists have acted inappropriately, and yet the same ministers who are under investigation through the ethics commissioner for the same act of lobbying were found to have done nothing wrong. So there's obviously a problem if the lobbyist did something wrong, but the ministers or senior civil servants didn't. So we had to clarify that. That would have been a good result of this act, where we clarify, in which again we would have come down to the issue, I believe, of the apparent conflict of interest role. There were certainly issues in terms of clarifying the roles of financial remuneration, particularly to top parliamentary secretaries, to ministers of the Crown, because these are the people who can be influenced. Right now, the reading of the Act is very narrow, that there has to be the personal benefit. But a personal benefit is not necessarily money paid to a riding association, and yet clearly there is a benefit to a lobbyist who's going to give money to a riding association. Now, this isn't to be draconian on this. We could have worked it out. What you'd want to make sure is if you're a senior minister and someone donates to you, You don't necessarily have the ability to check everybody who's donating to you, so you're not necessarily in a conflict of interest. However, if you're in your office and lobbyists are coming to you and you're saying, well, hey, I'm doing a fundraiser, one would think that then you are potentially in a conflict of interest, but if we're not using the word apparent, that issue isn't being clarified. So these were issues that needed to be addressed. Certainly, Canadians were wondering how is it possible that the most senior inside advisor to the Prime Minister could write a secret check of $90,000. Is that a conflict of interest? Is that a breach of the Act? These were things that needed to be clarified so we all understood the rules. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, that didn't happen. So let's talk about the administration of the Act, let's talk about who's under the Act, and let's talk about how this whole process was undermined. Now, in terms of the administration of the role of the Access to Information and Ethics Committee, we have the officers of Parliament who are some of the most finest civil servants I have had the honour to meet. The extreme professionalism we see from what we've had traditionally from the information, Access to Information Officer, the Privacy Commissioner, the Elections Canada, the Ethics, Lobbying Commissioners. They all play the role of ensuring that parliamentarians in government is accountable to the Canadian people. But we see the attack, the full-on attack against the credibility of the Elections Canada officer, head of Elections Canada, insinuating he was somehow partisan. That undermined his office, undermined the ability to do the work. We saw the attack, certainly on the parliamentary budget officer, Kevin Page, which was relentless and completely out of line, trying to undermine the work of an independent officer who's bringing forward the information that parliamentarians need. We see, certainly with the issue of the Privacy Commissioner and the recent appointment has caused a great deal of uncertainty in terms of his role, and I hope that he actually can fulfill his role with credibility despite what had happened under this government. And then we have the issue of the Conflict of Interest Act and how Mary Dawson is going to apply that act. Because, again, we've known that she has proven herself to be very literal when she reads the role of the act. So who is it that Mary Dawson should be overseeing, or the future Ethics Commissioner? And this was a big issue in terms of what we debated and we discussed and we heard from representative after representative of experts right across the political spectrum. The key issue is who is it that the ethics officer should be overseeing? So clearly, people who hold power, people who are in the ability to make decisions. So again, if you're a backbencher and you're writing a letter of support for your local business because that's what backbenchers do, that's considered okay. That is part of your business. But if you're sitting at the cabinet table, you're not supposed to be doing that because you have the power to influence in a way that the backbencher doesn't. So there's a gradation in terms of the role of responsibility and the role of accountability. Now, certainly, as an elected member of Parliament, you do have certain standards that you have to meet, certain ethical standards. But the Act isn't meant for the key people in terms of being able to influence power. So the cabinet ministers, the parliamentary secretaries, the key advisors around the Prime Minister would be considered to be part of that. These are the office holders who can be influenced and can influence. Who are the lobbyists attempting to influence? Who are they taking out to supper? Who are they buying gifts for? Who are they taking on trips? These are all the kind of questions that the Ethics Commissioner needs to deal with. And in the 2006 platform of the Conservative Party, they came forward with a number of recommendations about empowering an ethics commissioner. One of the recommendations was that people of the public should be able to make complaints. Now, this doesn't mean that the ethics commissioner is going to be burdened down with all manner of spurious complaints. In fact, if the ethics commissioner believes a complaint is spurious, she can write it off. But that members of the public should have the right to be able to ask for an investigation, and the Ethics Commissioner can decide whether or not to apply it. The issue of administrative monetary penalties was a fundamental principle in the 2006 Conservative platform. Administrative monetary penalties means that the Ethics Commissioner and as well the Lobbying Commissioner actually have the power to enforce the Act. so that they can hold people to account. Because we're being told that it's simply enough that they have moral weight, or that they ask you to stay after school, or they ask you to write an essay saying you promise you won't do it again. But if you're dealing with contracts that may be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and you've been seen to do something inappropriate, certainly the Lobbying and Ethics Commissioner should have the ability to bring forward administrative monetary penalties, and yet the government now is against that. They don't want these independent officers to have teeth. So we've talked about the people who hold the power, the people who make the decisions, the people who get lobbied, and the people who do the lobbying, the people who decide on procurement. Those were all, and people who are appointed to key government boards, the big public boards that people are brought forward on. These are all the people that we heard from again and again that should be under the Act, and to what extent they should be under the Act, and what rules should apply to them. That was the main oversight of our committee. And yet all that evidence was completely ignored, Mr. Speaker. And at the last minute, the Deus Ex Machina recommendation dropped in from the Prime Minister's office right in the middle of the recommendation number 1. Of all the recommendations we heard from the law societies, from the experts, recommendation number 1 that was rolled down right into our report as though it had actually been presented as evidence, which it hadn't, came down from the Prime Minister's office and said, from now on, anybody who has a union card and works in the civil service is going to be treated the same as ministers of the Crown. So that, well, certainly poor Mary Dawson was somewhat gobsmacked by that recommendation. We asked her, how many people would come under the Act? Well, how many people will now she have to administer? It'd be like telling Mary Dawson, in addition to making sure that the parliamentary secretaries of finance aren't being unduly lobbied, in addition to making sure that key ministers aren't hanging out and going out for weekend trips with key lobbyists, in addition to those under your job, you'll now have to look after more people than live in the city of Saskatoon or Longueuil. Double the population of Barrie. Now she is going to have to administer that act herself. So what that means, in a very simple and cynical fashion, is they have watered down the act to make her job functionally impossible. We asked her, how would she handle this recommendation? She said that simply she wouldn't be able to do it. They'd have to get some other body to do it. So right now, what they've done is they've decided that their number 1 recommendation, without any evidence, without any witnesses coming forward, is to make her office unable to do its job, which is keeping the key power brokers in the Conservative government accountable. The other thing that the Conservative government is pushing forward is they want secrecy. Now, for the government that tells us how much they believe in openness and transparency, what they believe in transparency is total transparency against their enemies and total secrecy for their friends. So they want to make it now that any investigation of any of their ministers or any of their friends who are doing wrongdoing has to be kept secret. They don't talk about that here tonight when you hear them talking about transparency and openness and data sets, and they were talking about radio waves, and they were talking about fish stocks earlier, but they weren't telling the Canadian public that one of the key recommendations they're bringing forward is to actually make the investigation process secret. Now, how does that help the Canadian public? Well, it certainly doesn't, but it'll certainly help the Conservative Party when it's about protecting them and hiding the information of whether or not wrongdoing's been done. Now, we have enormous respect for these institutions, and we believe that when recommendations are brought forward or questions for investigations, the spurious ones will be looked at and thrown out. But the Canadian public have a right to know that an investigation is underway, that the Ethics Commissioner has the right and should have the right to be able to say, yes, I've launched an investigation, and the person who's bringing it should be able to say it. As well, she should have the right to say, you know, I looked at it and I found that it was an absolutely ridiculous request for investigation, and no, I'm not doing it. That should be the power of an independent officer, which they are taking away, and they haven't said that. So, Mr. Speaker, there was a number of recommendations that they ignored. What you're seeing here is a sham. This is not based on what we heard. They completely ignored the 70-some recommendations from the Ethics Commissioner. They ignored the recommendations that came from the law societies and the people who deal with this, the administration of government who look at these issues. They ignored all those recommendations and brought in basically a whitewash will undermine this. But we believe that the power to bring in administrative monetary penalties, that's a key power that the ethics officer commissioner needs, as long as the lobbying commissioners. And that should be able to have the ability for suspension for a specified period, a suspension of a member's right to vote if they refuse to be compliant for a period of time, require reimbursement to the value of the gift. We spent hours and hours and hours, Mr. Speaker, talking about the gifts, the value of the gifts, whether it should be $30, whether it should be $50, whether there should be any limit at all. Now, personally, I think that a gift of $30 it's absurd to consider that somebody is going to be influenced by being given a snow globe or a photo book of Saskatoon in the spring. That's not going to influence you. What's going to influence you, Mr. Speaker, is being flown around the country or flown around Europe and being given tens of thousands of dollars in free gifts. That's an issue. But we spent hours and hours and hours and hours with arguing about gifts that were fundamentally irrelevant, because it treats the stupidity that as if the ethics abilities of the civil servants and key ministers, it makes it ridiculous. But the issue of gifts, at a certain point, we have to set a reasonable fee. We have to deal with the issue of fundraising and dealing with lobbyists. One, so it's fair, but two, so it's clear. None of that is in there. That ministers of state, parliamentary secretaries should ensure that government facilities and equipment, including ministerial and department letterhead, are not used in connection with fundraising activities. These are the straightforward, straight-up responsibilities that should be in the Act. That the ministerial code of conduct that the Prime Minister himself brought in should be made part of the Act. It's absolutely useless to have a code of conduct that is optional. How can you have a code of conduct for ethics that is optional? The Prime Minister had established what the rules were for ministers of the Crown. We should put it in the Act. And then that should be the standard that people apply to. The issue, again, I said about bringing complaints. It should be fair. If the public believes a complaint should be brought, the lobbying commissioner, the ethics commissioner, they have the ability, they should have the ability and power to decide whether it's reasonable or not. They extend the definition of ministerial staff to include those working within the minister's office on contract work. Now, this isn't to say that if you're in a member of Parliament's office and a student from your hometown comes, they should not be part of the Act. That would be absurd. But if you're dealing with a ministerial office and you're coming in and you're doing contract work, well, while you're in the minister's office, you are part of the overall decision-making, and you would be under the period of time. That would be a reasonable thing. It wouldn't be, again, reasonable to apply that to every single person who comes in to volunteer in a Members of Parliament office or even over in the Senate, for God, imagine if they ever did become accountable. But again, these are the lines that we have to start defining between what is the reasonable request and what's the unreasonable request, what's doable and what's not doable. We believe right now we could reduce the gift. So I said earlier there was talk about $30, there was talk about $500. Right now it's $200. We believe a $100 gift's fair. So if you go out for lunch with someone, they're not going to bust down your doors and come after you if you don't say that you spent $100 going out for lunch with someone. That would be, or you paid for someone's lunch at $100, or someone gave you I mean, I'd love a Saskatchewan Roughriders hockey or jacket, you know, but nobody's ever given me one. But if it was under $100, that would be perfectly fine. If it was over $100, those are reasonable things. And then make the automatic divestment rules for reporting public office holders with significant decision-making power, access to privileged information, including but not limited to ministers of state, parliamentary secretaries, chiefs of staff, deputy ministers, ministerial staff, and employees of minister's office. Keep those rules in place. But to extend it to 260,000 civil servants across the country, Mr. Speaker, will make this act unenforceable and will dilute the role of the Ethics Commissioner and will make a mockery of the work of our committee. Thank you very much.